Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're doing a very, very special episode today because it's actually two channels joining together to have a discussion. I think it's needed more often, especially when we see errors. And instead of creating 7-8 different videos, sometimes it's nice just to put together one video and collaborate doing that. I've got my friend Erik with me from Testify and his audience. Excited to have you on, Erik. This video just came out today, fresh. And I had already had an idea to respond. You sent a message to the whole group, and I was like, hey, I already have a response. Why don't we just do it together? And here we are.
I watched the video, and I was like, man, like these are arguments you and I have heard before. And I just happened to post the link saying, hey, I just watched this, and it was kind of frustrating. And you were like, well, I'm going live in like 2 hours and responding to it. I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll get in on that. So
yeah, and I think that it's something, I was a little bit surprised that O'Connor went to the extent he did on some of these points, because in some sense I have a respect for him. I try to, at least. And the points that he made here, I thought in some cases were very petty, overstated, and exaggerated. And then some of them, I don't even think they were worth griping.
Which is ironic because that's what he's accusing Wes of doing.
The exact
same thing.
Yep. Yeah. It's almost like looking in the mirror. And so our goal here is to play the clip on the video. I have it in the link for those that want to watch it. If you have not yet seen it, you're going to at least see the main segments of it because we're just going to review it here. If you want to click that link and watch it later in full, feel free to do that. Because our goal is not to misrepresent anybody when we do episodes like this. Our goal is to actually just hear them out and then say this is our response to it. So we don't want to waste a lot of time here. We want to jump right into it. So let me go ahead and bring up the first clip.
And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That would be amazing.
All right, we'll just pause it right there because this is the Pelugia brought this up. There's been a couple of other responses.
Did you say Pelugia?
I always say that. I do that
on purpose.
It's kind of
to annoy him.
It's kind of a knock, but I try not to. He knows I do it, so I don't think he'll be mad. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe he'll make a video.
Paulo Gugu Gagia.
But he put out a response just yesterday. I believe it was yesterday or the day before.
Yeah.
And this is another highlighted thing. Now, Wes told me, and I'll read his message word for word, just so that everybody is not confused about his belief. He said, you are more than welcome to mention that I do think that the Isaiah scroll has variants, and I'm actually in the process of making a video outlining what I meant and what I should have said better. That is word for word from Wes. All right. He told me before we went on this, he's like, feel free to share that. He said, it's not a secret. I had to do this the other night when responding to Derek on Myth Vision and dealing with Gnostic Informant with their accusations. There's a lot of where they think he's going and where I know he was going, but didn't get to say all that he wanted to say. What Wes, I believe, was trying to say is there's nothing major, like when you look at the theology, the teachings that are different from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic text. And then what ends up happening is Gnostic Informant and others, they hear that and they go, oh, no. There's variants. There's definitely variants. And there are. And Alex is right. There are variants between, and he brought up 2,600. By the way, I think that is extremely mild. I know that's kind of a number that gets thrown around. I was actually just in Isaiah 53. This has been a while since I've looked at it. Just in the first 3 verses of chapter 53, there's a total of 23 words in the Masoretic text, 24 in the Great Isaiah Scroll. And in those, there's about 18 to 19 letters that were different between just that small section. And this is a long time ago I was looking over this. And the reason that people don't count those a lot of times, Erik, is because they mean nothing. They change nothing. They're minuscule. Right. And
Right.
that's what's happening. So yeah, and even O'Connor said it. I don't know if you caught that. Most of the 2600, they're just spelling and stuff. It's like, then why major in the minor, right? There are differences, like you mentioned. It's true. It looks like there's
Yeah.
interpolations and stuff like that. Nobody denies that, but it doesn't change anything that we've believed about Isaiah all along.
I think a lot of us would say that, like, Wes, maybe he misspoke. I don't know. I'm going to let him clarify for himself. So I think you need to give the man an opportunity more to clarify for himself. You're friends with him. I know him a little bit. I've had him on my channel. We've both worked with talk. We all work with talk about doubts, and so we've had different calls and conversations. And it's just like, it's kind of like the everyone's pouncing. To use a news, skeptics
Yes.
pounce, but they're pouncing on something that he said. He probably
True.
misspoke. I wouldn't have probably said it word for word. I would say thought for thought would be accurate. I would say it conveys the exact same message. It's extremely accurate or something. I'll let Wes explain, on the details, but like, Dan McClellan's already responded to it. Dan himself had to admit that he got it wrong and he overstated his side of things.
Yep.
And then he had to issue an apology to Wes. Let it just work out. Instead, like, you get up in front of 3 million people or whatever. How many people are watching Joe Rogan?
It's up to 5 now, I think.
Yeah, and like, not misspeak, And so I'm not trying to excuse it. It was a mistake. We don't know what kind of a mistake it was. I don't think he was trying to oversell it. It's like there's this idea in people's heads. He's just a dishonest apologist, and so he's lying to Joe Rogan to make Christianity look more plausible. And like, instead of assuming the worst, like, maybe just call him out nicely about it. Like, I think Kip Davis, had some pushback that I thought was professional and friendly. And Kip Davis knows the Dead Sea Scrolls probably better than anybody that I know, personally. I don't know all
about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, and I think Wes has been fair to say, you know what, that wasn't, like, he's gone back and forth with Dan McClellan, and Dan took it, and he's issuing a correction. So people just need to chill out on the whole word for word thing a little bit, and just let the guy explain himself.
I think it's a good point that you brought up too. When I talked to Wes last night, we were studying together for almost 2 hours on an upcoming debate. And he told me, I don't think people realize what was happening, what's going on in this. He's sitting there for long hours, 3+ hours. He doesn't have his computer with him. He doesn't have all of his notes. He doesn't have all these, references and points and documents sitting right in front of him. It's a casual conversation. It's questions that were not like, oh, here's a script. We're going to follow the script the whole time.
Yeah.
That's exhausting.
Rogan's always all over the place. Rogan.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. How many subjects did they cover? They went from Old Testament manuscripts, New Testament manuscripts, miracles, resurrection. I mean, they pretty much covered the nature of Christianity from start to finish, from Old to New Testament. He was getting into
science and all kinds of stuff, and Wes was kind of like, yeah, sure, Joe, I don't know anything about that. Like that's I kind of felt bad for Wes at times. I'm like, Joe, like, talk about New Testament manuscripts, like, get into his kitchen a little bit instead of like meandering so much.
I think that's a good way to approach it, is like, let's put the whole conversation in context, and let's not act like, and I even said this about Dan McClellan, let's not act like you've never ever said something. Let's not act like you've ever sold something or ever misspoke and used the wrong word. When we start doing apologetics this way, it drives me insane. Not just when they do this. It drives me insane when Christian apologists do this too. You're going to start majoring on the minor, and we're going to start missing the whole entire point. I don't like that approach. And here's a situation where I know Wes knows that no two manuscripts are equal. He knows that even if you're looking at a New Testament manuscript, the two closest manuscripts we have, probably maybe Family 35 in the New Testament. When you're looking at these manuscripts, there's always variance in every chapter, in every page. Even if they're minuscule and not even translatable, there's always variance. So I know that Wes knows that's not the truth at all times. So again, to belabor this point, is completely unnecessary. So let's pull him back
Yeah.
up in on the stage and let's see what he does. I'm
Yeah.
gonna go to the next minute mark.
We could skip unless you still want to cover the Isaiah stuff. I've seen enough.
No, I'm gonna go into the next section, which honestly was the biggest trigger and shock to me.
Okay, moving
Yeah.
on to the New Testament.
Was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, that's crazy.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later, pretty bananas.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself. And then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead. We're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years, because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
There was quite a lot there. First, Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do.
All right, I'll let you go first. I'll let you go first.
Yeah. Like, I mean, this is crazy. Jesus didn't call himself God in the synoptics. Like is he reading the synoptics? This just feels like a tired Bart Ehrman talking point.
Yep.
Jesus, if the disciple, if he really said that, this thunderously important thing, don't you think that it would have been in the synoptics? I mean, I can just kind of hear the echoes in my head. Well, it's like, I don't know what synoptic gospels he's reading, but like, for example, here's Matthew 21, right? He just cleanses the temple. And I think there's the triumphal entry and all that other kind of stuff. And the children are crying out in the temple. This is the ESV, Matthew 21. Hosanna to the Son of David. They were indignant. And he said, did you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have perfected praise. Well, what is Jesus quoting right there? He's quoting the 8th Psalm. Who is the 8th Psalm ascribed to? It's ascribed to Yahweh. So he's saying that the praises that are directed towards me, he quotes that. He's basically calling himself Yahweh by saying these praises that these children are directed towards me, they're directed towards Yahweh. Thus, I am Yahweh. Like, and then also, like, what do you, when he's standing before the Sanhedrin in Mark chapter 14, and they just flat out ask him, are you the Son of God, or the blessed one, or whatever? And he says basically, like, yeah, you guys said it yourself. I'm the Son of Man. And he basically quotes Daniel 7:13 through 14, and Psalm 110. And he is like, yeah, I'm the guy. There is a two powers theology that already exists in first century Judaism, Second Temple Judaism. And so those are just two, like, right off the top of my head. I could think of others.
Yeah.
But it's just like,
let me give a rundown.
Yeah.
Let's overkill an unnecessary comment in the whole video, because he decided out of the 3 hours of footage to pull that and make a point. Yeah. So let's belabor the point, shall we? All right. Luke chapter 1, Mark chapter 1, Matthew chapter 1. Let's just take the very beginning into Matthew chapter 2. Let's just take the first 3 synoptics. Let's go in order. Mark chapter 1. At the very beginning, it introduces a character, John the Baptist, who is sent in fulfillment of the prophet Isaiah and Malachi to prepare the way of the Lord. And lo and behold, the Lord comes on the scene and he's introduced, and John is the forerunner to do the work of fulfillment of preparing the way of the Lord, directly pointing to Jesus being the Lord. He's fulfilling that. Luke chapter 1, Mary's pregnant. She finds out she's pregnant from the angel. She goes to Elizabeth and Zachariah. She knocks on the door. The baby in Elizabeth's womb leaps, greets her, and says that Mary is the mother of my Lord. That's right there in Luke chapter number 1, the mother of my Lord. This is where the whole teaching, the Theotokos, came from, where people were debating what Mary should be viewed as, what Jesus should have been viewed as. A 50-50 God-man? Is he 100% God, 100% man? How does this work? Hypostatic union stuff. These are the passages they were in, not John. They were in Luke 1, looking at the titles that Elizabeth gave to Mary. She is the mother of my Lord in Luke chapter 1. This is where we get the mother of God kind of terminology in the Theotokos. How about in Matthew's gospel? We see that no one is prescribed worship in the Old and New Testament except to God himself. There is no worship of any other God. Yet we find these magi coming from afar. And what do? They bow and worship a child. They worship. This becomes a regular theme, particularly for Matthew, because then there's the temptation scenes where Jesus even talking to Satan, where he says, if you will do these things, and if you will do these things, he gives him the 3 temptations. And he said, you should only worship the Lord your God and him only. And by the end of the narration, we go into Matthew's gospel, we find in the end, right before he ascends, his disciples worship him, and then he disappears out of their sight. You see the same thing in the last 2 verses of the Gospel of Luke. They worship him, and then they go back to Jerusalem.
Yeah, they worship him right after he walks on water as well, right? And then what do we see, just to tag on to that super quickly?
No, keep going. Let's keep going.
Acts when Paul is being worshipped by the Lycaonians, he's like, whoa, don't do that, right? And then you see the same thing in Revelation, right? John gets overawed and he starts prostrating before an angel, basically, and starts worshiping. And the angel rebukes him. He's like, no,
only worship the Lord.
Only worship the Lord. And so it's just like, what? If Alex wants to say, like, dispute these as being genuine, then he's going to have to clarify these things, just like he's nitpicking at Wes for not clarifying enough. Like, clarify these things.
Jesus' own name in Matthew 1, Emmanuel, God with us. That's his name. You call him God with us.
Yeah.
And the Son of Man claims from Daniel 7. I mean, Mark 4, the angels ministering to him, which is a fulfillment of the Old Testament, where the spirits are sent to be ministering spirits of Yahweh. All of I think we've belabored the point. I feel like we could spend an entire episode just talking about where the synoptics are alluding Jesus being the father figure in the prodigal son of God receiving sinners. He's making himself that point in the parable to the chickens, to the mother chick who hovers over with her wings, her chicks, her baby chicks, taking us back to the Old Testament imagery of God protecting his people. Jesus is likening himself. I would have done this for you. He is making absolute claim to be the very prophetic instrument to Israel that God always was, and that he was sent to actually bring it to an end. Over and over and over again in the synoptics. We can't even get out of Matthew 1, Mark 1, and Luke 1 without already finding that kind of terminology.
Yeah.
To me, that was an insane point.
Yeah, it was weird. And again, going back to Mark 14:62, Jesus says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. Again, that's an allusion to the 110th Psalm. And then coming on the clouds of heaven, right? Oh. Well, again, that harkens back to Daniel 7:13-14, where there's this Son of Man figure who walks into basically the throne room of God, sits at his right hand, and all the nations serve him. This is why the high priest tore their clothes. And then who in scripture rides the clouds? Isaiah 19:1. God rides a cloud in judgment over Egypt.
Yep.
Psalm 104:3, he makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. Psalm 64:8, sing to the Lord, sing praises to his name, extol him who rides the clouds. By his name, Yah, and rejoice before him. And so we could go on and on. It would be a whole stream to talk about all the deity of Christ kind of claims that you could find in the Synoptics. So, yeah, this was really weak, just regurgitated Barterman talking point that, like, I know Alex O'Connor prides himself in being more fair-minded of a skeptic than others, but like, bro, like, come on now, like,
well,
you could
let's
do better
be real
than
with
this.
this too. What was the point of Wes? Wes didn't explicitly. Rogan did not ask him, give me 2 reasons for this, and tell me a synoptic gospel answer. Wes was simply just making a point that Jesus did. And Cosmic Skeptic goes and says, well, none of the synoptics say this, only John. And then I dispute whether John said it. Okay, what if, and we just showed that it's not true with the synoptics. What if it is just John's gospel? Does that change Wes's answer to Joe Rogan as a Christian who believes John is one of our 4 gospels that should be believed, practiced, and read in churches, preached and taught and lived by? What if Wes was just with John's gospel and that's all he had? He's still answering Joe Rogan's point exactly the way it was, because we do believe John's gospel is teaching Jesus's ego eimi, these I am statements. We do believe, and I find it interesting that Alex skips the very first words of John 1. He goes to these other links. He skips that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. Like, he skips the very beginning essence of John taking a very philosophical idea of the Logos, and he's actually taking it over and showing that he's not just an invisible power believed by the Greeks. He is actually knowable. He's become incarnate. He took on flesh. That's John 1:14-16. Like, I mean, when you look at this, it's interesting. He jumped to these other claims because it's like Alex already knows where Christians go to John's gospel to find the deity of Christ. And he was already ready to debunk it. And then he started debunking and said, well, that's for another video on another day. Well, no. Like, you can't do that. Like,
I mean, it's like whatever. I don't know. There's nothing to be ashamed of. Christians, you have no reason to be ashamed of John's gospel. It's a perfectly historically reliable book. Just all this stuff of like, it's so different and it's so much later, which we'll talk about because Alex is going to bring it up here in a second. It's just a lot of bogus charges, in my opinion. It's just like a lot of like plausible sounding arguments from scholars, but when you really look at them and dig into them, they're just not nearly as strong as they make them out to be.
All right, let me get a couple of questions up before we go in here. I think that'll be fair. There's people doing super chats for you there. I want to make sure to bring them.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Do you hear that Wes Huff got on Joe Rogan? No. Somebody please tell us. It's news to me.
Thanks, Chimp.
Let's see. There's one more real quick. Yeah, if you want to send a super chat, we'll make sure we'll try to get your super chats. It's totally fine. Alex also assumed that the average age at the time meant that they could live long enough to be eyewitnesses and didn't count for infant mortality. Any comments on that one?
No, that's an extremely good point, right? Like, you can't just look at averages. Once they get out of that range, like, how long do those people live? Is it so unheard of that, like, oh my gosh, somebody lived beyond their 50s or 60s or 70s? And like, first of all, he's assuming that any early dating arguments are just not good. And then second of all, he's just assuming that these guys all would they'd have to be dead. They must have got sick. And it's like, he's not taking that into consideration. And so, no, it's an excellent point.
And we'll probably get into that a little bit more as we go through the video here. So I'm going to skip ahead to, let's see, I think the next section. There's a couple. I don't want to spend too much. Here we go.
Yeah.
I want to get on the growth of Christianity, because I thought this was an interesting parallel that he tries to give here.
Right.
Estimates that in its first 300 years, Christianity grew at a rate of 40% per decade, from a small group in the 1st century to 3 million in the 4th century. That sounds pretty impressive, until you learn that this is the same growth rate experienced by Mormonism since its foundation in the 19th century. So if the rate of Christianity's growth is good evidence of its truth, Mormonism just became a whole lot more plausible. By the way, we actually have 11 eyewitnesses to the Mormon golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events. We don't have anything like this kind of extant written testimony for the resurrection of Jesus, which
All right. I know you're chomping at the bit.
Okay, this is such a stupid comparison. Okay, let's just grant for the sake of argument that people saw golden plates. Okay. That tells us absolutely zero about the content of what was on those plates. You're just assuming that Joseph had some sort of spiritual gift to be able to translate them or interpret them through looking at a rock and a hat, is what we know, right? That is not the same thing as touching a living resurrected person, eating broiled fish with them, or having a big conversation, a group conversation with a bunch of your disciples, okay, and having these multi-sensory experiences. Okay, so that leaves us down to three witnesses that claim to see the angel Moroni. What were the angel Moroni? What was the experience like? What was it like? Did they give us any details? Did they give us any details whatsoever at all? No, they didn't. Okay. Now, Alex is going to belabor this whole thing about when we get to the 1 Corinthians 15 section and the appearance to the 400, 500, whatever. Wes misspoke, and we got to harp on that a little bit too. He was nicer about it than Apologia.
That's true.
Apologia
true.
Didn't grill him too hard about it, but he
spent an extra 30 seconds on it. That's for sure.
Yeah. But at any rate, like, we have, whether they saw plates or not, I don't really care. Right? We don't know what the contents of those plates were. We got one guy who supposedly can interpret these plates, and we know that the Book of Mormon is full of anachronisms. It's full of mistakes. It's copying the King James Bible. It talks about civilizations that we have no external corroboration of their existence whatsoever. And also, we know that Smith was a sketchy person in terms of being a translator from the whole Book of Abraham fiasco, where he buys a papyrus that some guy is selling and then mutilates it and says that it's Abraham being sacrificed or something like that. And then people come along and they actually, who can read the papyrus, find out that no, bro, it's a total fraud. He's just pulling this stuff out of his rear end and making stuff up.
See, this is the part this is the part that bothered me, Eric, is that, like, we're comparing golden plates to a person back from the dead. Okay, that's what he chose to compare here. And the reason he chose that is because Wes had made a point that 11 fearful men in an upper room were scared. And then next thing you know, something happened and it changed the way that they took their lives, to the point where they changed and radicalized the entire Roman Empire. Within a couple hundred years, the gospel makes over. Next thing you know, the Roman Empire almost becomes Christianized by the time of Constantine. That's what Wes was getting at. He wasn't talking about growth rates. He wasn't saying,
he's not saying Christianity is popular, therefore it's true.
Yeah, because it's the popular thing to do, Christianity's now proved itself to be. Wes knows, and we know, that there was no popularity for Christianity really in the first 15, but really, I would say 150 to 200 years. Christianity was under wraps. I mean, it's underground church. I mean, these people are practicing an illegal religion. They were only known for being illegal more than actually anything else. But even with that being said, that wasn't the point. He made Wes' comment out to be popularity wins. And that's not what Wes was saying. That's not what Wes was getting into. And then you have the audacity to compare golden plate images that were eyewitnesses saw these golden plates, but can't tell you what's on them, compared to people who actually said that they touched, felt, saw, talked to, and ate with the resurrected man who was dead and mutilely crucified on a Roman cross, and now he's alive. I think that's a little bit different than just seeing some plates.
Right.
Maybe I'm the only one that thinks that's a ridiculous comparison, to look at a resurrected person to some golden plates that nobody can tell you what they said or meant or interpreted.
Right. Yeah, it's bananas. I thought it was a weird comparison. It was an uncharitable way to look at Wes's argument. I don't think he's saying Christianity is popular, therefore it's true.
No.
Although we could make an argument in one sense that, like, there was a prophecy in Isaiah of somebody who would be rejected and abhorred by the nation, but yet this servant would become a light to all nations, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, like, you could link that up if you really wanted to. Wes wasn't doing that. He's just talking casually to Joe. He's just saying, hey, this is kind of outstanding that they made this impact, but it's not necessarily saying popular, therefore true. It's just an uncharitable way to look at it.
Take Malachi 1's prophecy, since you brought up Isaiah. Malachi 1, God speaks of people who will offer a pure sacrifice and incense to him throughout the whole world. That would have made absolutely no sense to a Second Temple Judaism, who believed that only worship could be done in the temple, that worship could only be accomplished in the temple. And now God is saying, hey, there's going to be a day where people everywhere are going to be able to actually offer a pure sacrifice and incense to me. That's not even God saying that's going to be the majority. That's going to be the majority. No, God's just saying that Israel's not going to contain my glory anymore. It's going to be spread out.
Right.
We see hints of this, Eric, in John's gospel when Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. She's like, well, you guys say that God must be worshipped here. Our fathers say that he should be worshipped on this mountain. Jesus is like, neither here nor there is going to matter, because the kingdom is here, I'm here, and therefore there's not going to be a singular location of worship anymore.
Right.
We already see that unraveling in John's gospel. So even the prophecies like Isaiah or like Malachi, it's not saying that Christianity or some new religion or new covenant is going to come and take over the world, where that's going to be the world religion or something. Like, that's not even what the prophecies are saying. So to me, for Alex to pull that move was a little bit disingenuous, and it was a faulty comparison to bring Mormonism into it, because they're not even witnessing the same kind of event. We're talking about a resurrected man who was mutilated on a cross versus some golden plates that mysteriously disappeared into the clouds. Okay, a little bit different there, but we'll let him continue, because there's more to say.
Yeah.
Which we're about to get onto. But I just thought it was worth a mention.
It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We, as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on. For. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
Okay, it gets a bit speculative here. Scholarly consensus is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written around 70 AD. This is some 40 years after Jesus died, and likely after the death of most of the eyewitnesses, given life expectancy in the ancient world. But even if it were written earlier, even if it were written by Mark himself, we're talking about the resurrection here. And notice that the earliest version of Mark's gospel does not contain any descriptions of post-resurrection appearances. It ends with the empty tomb and a disappeared Jesus, and suggests that he will appear to people, but it doesn't record those appearances. So even if it's written by an eyewitness, it doesn't report anything about the resurrected Jesus.
My goodness. So much there, Eric. So much.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. And so we're just assuming that because Mark wrote a gospel and his is the first one, we're going to assume that. We'll just, I don't have a problem granting that. That anything that comes later, Matthew's gospel, Luke's gospel, John's gospel, all of these other appearances must be like some kind of embellishment, them adding details or something else. I don't think that Matthew, this is my opinion, and this isn't just my opinion. This is, or excuse me, I said Matthew, I meant Mark. This isn't just my opinion. This is Robert Stein's opinion. This is Robert Gundry's opinion. This is N.T. Wright's opinion. I don't think Matthew, or excuse me, I keep saying that, keep speaking. The 400, the 400 in Matthew. No, I'm just kidding. Mark intended to finish his gospel right there. This is also Bruce Metzger's opinion, Bruce Metzger's opinion. And so for the fact that Stein argues, and I just put out a video on this responding to the Muslim polemicist Hamza, basically Jesus predicts his resurrection. He predicts that there's going to be appearances in Galilee. Mark's gospel all throughout is talking about like fulfilled prophecy, right? There's all kinds of prophecies that are alluded to or hinted at in Mark's gospel. And then Jesus is making some of his own prophecies. Obviously, they're not going to include the destruction of the temple. But they would be really weird of them to just have this emphasis on prophecy, have Jesus make a prophecy about appearances, and then we got nothing, bupkis, crickets. Okay. So there's an article by Robert Stein. People can look it up about the ending of Mark's gospel. N.T. Wright subscribes to it. Gundry subscribes to it. There's also the fact that the Greek word gar is how
it ends on a preposition.
It ends on a proposition. And that's what Metzger says. He's like, there's no way. So a lot of these guys, for these reasons, speculate that ending was just lost. And we don't know exactly what it says. And obviously that's why somebody else came and filled it out, or whatever. There's a whole debate on that and all that other stuff. So to just kind of take something that we don't even know what it said and just assume like, okay, well, no physical appearances, anybody. We're just going to leave on this weird kind of cliffhanger. Seems kind of goofy to me. And then we just have to assume that Matthew or John or Luke couldn't have any independent information whatsoever.
No,
even though Luke explicitly talks about talking to eyewitnesses, and John claims to be a witness, and Matthew is a disciple. And if we could argue for the traditional authorship of Matthew and all that other kind of stuff, we're just going to assume that any extra information they come and give us must just be them pulling stuff kind of out of their behind, right? And I just don't think that that's a good way of looking at this at all.
Well, and that's the point too. So I recently was on Myth Vision with it was Derek, myself, and Gnostic Informant. So we were on there. This is the very thing we're talking about in Mark's gospel. And the point I brought up there, and Derek actually cut it short, we didn't get a chance to cover it that much, is that this idea, well, it just says the tomb's empty, the angel said he's risen, but there's no post-resurrection appearance. But I demonstrated very quickly, if somebody wants to go back to Myth Vision's video and see where I was just on it last week, I was just on it.
Yep.
I talked about how Mark's gospel is taking a different angle. First of all, it's a collective. We know from history and even from the internal evidence, just go to Inspiring Philosophy. Michael and I co-wrote a series on the Gospels, the story behind Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Please just go back. That's not the point of this episode as much. But one of the things that we know from Mark's gospel, that it is collected oral traditions going back to probably Peter, and that was given a massive amount of information that Mark is writing down sermons, just as Papias of Hierapolis says. In that representation of Peter's sermons, we find from the very beginning of Mark's gospel, multiple places where Jesus is predicting his own death, which is what Wes was talking about, that Jesus predicted his own death, tried to tell his disciples that he would die. He finally gets there. Well, while he's in the triumphal entry moving into the city of Jerusalem, he tells his disciples that he's going to be crucified by the religious leaders, and after 3 days, he's going to rise again from the dead, and he will meet them in Galilee. I think it is underestimated, Eric, how much we miss that point, that in the predictive nature, Mark's not trying to tell you post-resurrection. He's trying to tell you that pre-resurrection was in sight from the very beginning of the teaching. Jesus foresaw his own death, his own resurrection, tried to teach his disciples it was going to happen. They didn't fully believe it. They didn't fully understand it. And then all of a sudden it happens. And now there's a message to the women. Go tell my disciples and Peter, I'll meet you in Galilee. Why Galilee? And there's a reason that Mark's gospel explicitly focuses on the location of Galilee and that Jesus predicted it. And we don't have time to get into the Galilean reasons here either. But I'm so sick of the narrative that, well, Mark is by itself, you would never get a resurrection narrative because there's no post-resurrection appearance. You got to get Luke and Matthew, like you just said, like, as if they don't count and have independent sources. But even with Mark, it's missing the design. It's missing the point of Mark. It's missing that he's already teaching these things to people who know the end of the story. But he's trying to give this audience, these Christians in Rome, a reason to see Jesus through a different lens. Not so much that he's resurrected and appeared to people. Of course, they already know that. The audience already knows that. They've come to believe that themselves. So Peter doesn't need to rehash it all for him, nor does Mark for that matter. His point is to show Jesus's resurrection was predicted by himself, and he wanted to make a point. And that's what Mark echoes more than Luke and Matthew and John, that precedes his own death, burial, and resurrection. And that's what Wes was actually getting into when he said he was predicting his own death, burial, and resurrection. So let's bring our friend back up again. And I'm going to skip to a different section here. I'm going to go closer to, here we go. I think about right here.
Roles. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably second century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus. So it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript, which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably, and potentially even, like, most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
Wow.
He correctly points out that there is dispute in the dating here. But notice that while Wes places P52 in the 2nd century,
it's comfortably 2nd century.
He pushes John's Gospel itself at minimum and comfortably back into the 1st century.
Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably.
Why? Well, because of the time it would take after John wrote the Gospel in Ephesus for it to travel to Egypt and be copied.
Written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript.
A few problems with this. First, Wes assumes that the 4th Gospel really was written by John the Apostle in Ephesus. This is, to say the least, heavily contested by New Testament scholars. But even so, Egypt just isn't all that far away from Ephesus, reachable in a few weeks for an ancient traveler, maybe a bit longer. Originally, P52 was thought to date between 100 and 150 AD. Split the difference at 125. Even if this early dating is correct, that still gives us 25 years for the gospel to have traveled from Ephesus to Egypt and still have been written within the 2nd century. But of course...
All right. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
let's back it up. Let's go back to John being 1st century. Wes's point.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a quote. I have a quote from Wes. I will share.
Yeah.
The thing that I think bothers me about what happened here. Let's see here. He says, because remember, he's giving a manuscript. He had a facsimile made. He gives it to Joe Rogan. It's of P52. It's an early witness of John's gospel. Rogan's kind of inquiring, like, what's the speciality of this? That's what's happening here. We got to keep that in mind. He said, his point about me using P52, this is Wes Wes's exact statement.
Yeah.
His point about me using P52 missed what was going on. That wasn't necessarily my point. Just that we were talking about the upheaval of consensus. And I used it to give to Rogan the papyri and explain what it did in Robert's day. Now, the point that Wes is getting at here is there was an argument at the time that John's gospel was late 2nd century. There was a time where this was believed in German scholarship. That was believed at a certain point in history. And then they find this papyrus manuscript that is being dated to the middle of the 2nd century. Now, if it was at the middle of the 2nd century, and even O'Connor gives us let's just split the difference and say 125. Okay, if it's 125, John's gospel is definitely not at the end. But I think O'Connor would take a later date of P52. I think O'Connor would probably land at the end of the set, probably about 200, because why not? We don't want it to be any earlier. But let's just say it's 150 for the sake of argument. If the Gospel of John and a copy in Alexandria is 150, the Gospel of John could not have been written between 175 and 200, as some scholars were alleging. The copy cannot predate the final work. So here's the point that Wes was actually making. O'Connor turns this into a Johannine authorship, which I know that Wes, obviously, like us, agree that John was involved in the Gospel of John. And then he makes it into a dating of John's Gospel, which Wes's point was not. Wes didn't even give a date because Wes could have used the argument that John died around the year 101, according to Jerome, 101, 102, as a very, very old man. He could have took a couple of statements from later church fathers who said that John actually finished the Gospel of John after he received the apocalyptic vision on the island of Patmos. So he could have said that John's Gospel was very late and was done around 100 AD, which is 2nd century, the first year of the 2nd century. But that wasn't the point of discussion, was it? That wasn't the point. You could hold Johannine authorship and place John's Gospel based on church father statements, the age of John's death, the timing of John's death, and still say that John's Gospel is 2nd century, and it still be Johannine authorized. I don't think it is. Some would try to put it earlier in 70. I'm more in the 80s, 90s. There's different views here. But whoever wrote John's Gospel, and Eric, you and I talked about this, clearly had memory of the temple, of feast days, of locations. Like, just speak to that first, because I think that's where O'Connor went really wrong.
Yeah, like I think he again, I feel like there was like a pouncing, skeptics pounce, but where he says something in a specific context after he gives Joe this really cool gift, and the fact that like Wes can even make these things is just kind of unbelievable.
Impressive.
And tells you how much of a nerd he is. But Wes, if you're watching, I mean that in a good way. But I don't think he's necessarily hinging his entire argument on this is how we know John is 1st century. It was just a point that he was making, like you said. That being said, I would think it's kind of ludicrous to date John's Gospel to the 2nd century for the fact that the guy just knows way too much about 1st century Palestine for it to be a 2nd century product, right? And so there is, he mentions in John 10 that there's this Solomon's portico, and that Jesus was teaching there, which is where he made the statement, I and my Father are one, by the way. And this particular portico would have been a great spot because it was wintertime to get away from the winds. And Jesus is teaching there. And so that shows some 1st century knowledge, right? There's also the Feast of Tabernacles. In John chapter 7, Jesus gets up on the last day of the feast, it says, and he shouts, if anyone's thirsty, come to me and drink, and out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water, right? To quote the good old King Jimmy there. And so, but he's referring to, I know that's your favorite translation. He's referring to a water pouring ceremony that they would do during this particular, and we know about this water pouring testimony because it's in the Talmud, that they would do for I think like 8 days, and that's when the feast would end. And so Jesus is making this like really strong point, but this was something that it's really doubtful that somebody in like the 2nd or 3rd century probably would have known about this, writing from wherever it was. It seems to be better explained that somebody has knowledge of what was going on, their traditions, the customs at the particular time. John mentions that there was basically 5 colonnades in John chapter 5 about the pool of Bethesda, and archaeologists have discovered that. There's the discovery of the pool of Siloam. Again,
Siloam,
that
yeah.
seems to show a lot of local knowledge. He knows that Bethany is just basically a couple miles from Jerusalem. He knows that in John chapter 2, verse 12, it says after the Feast of Cana, they go down to Capernaum. Well, Cana's elevation is like, I want to say 2,500 feet, and Capernaum's elevation is like 2,500 below sea level. So he knows that's going down. And there's just more and more things that I can get into regarding customs, regarding geography, regarding just his knowledge of the times, that I think it's kind of silly to try and push John way out. I have no problem saying it's later. I don't even have a problem saying the Christology in it looks more developed. But I don't think Wes was just hanging his entire early dating argument on this particular thing. He was just talking about the manuscript. There's other reasons that support early dating for John's gospel.
Yeah, and his point of transmission is weak. It's like, well, I mean, there's still 25 years. Even if it's 125, there's still 25 years. You're telling me it takes that long to get over there. Well, you're assuming that P52 is the first copy.
Right.
I mean, that there's a major assumption there. Well, it only takes a few weeks, and he tries to show a map between, Ephesus and basically, Asia Minor over to the point of Alexandria, and said, well, it's only a few weeks trip. Well, let's just be clear. If John's gospel was published, there wasn't a, horseback rider messenger sitting there waiting for the ink to dry to throw it on saddleback and take off all the way down to Alexandria to bring the copy immediately within 2 weeks. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Like the expansion of the Gospels, it does take time and it takes copy. So it wasn't like an original manuscript was in Ephesus, was taken all the way down to Alexandria, Egypt, and that P52 is the first copy of the original or something like that. We don't know. It could have been that a copy of a copy of a copy made it to Alexandria, Egypt, and P52 is a 4th or 5th. We don't know. That's the point. But the point that Wes was trying to make is that the scholarship has tried to put John's gospel so late that they've even pushed it to the mid and late 2nd century, including German scholarship. And one single manuscript discovery diminished that theory that John's gospel was that late. And
Right.
Here they are again, trying to continue to disprove all the things that make John's gospel eyewitness based. Because I'm telling you right now, like if you were to put Wes in a corner and say, Wes, are you over here saying that John's gospel is 68 AD, 95 AD, or 101 AD? I don't think that Wes would care. I think he'd have a personal opinion. I think this is what Wes's answer would go like. It'd be the same as mine. I'm not sure. I would seem to lean that it goes this way, but my main point is it is based on eyewitness report. You want to put that in the 60s, the 80s, the 90s, or 100 and 101. It's based on eyewitness report. And you just gave a short summary. And again, folks, go back, those that are listening to Erik, he's done discussions on this. I've done discussions on this. We've done debates on this. We've, Inspiring Philosophy's channel, again, co-wrote with Michael a whole series on this. All the reasons you need to find, we have in-depth answers. We're not waving the hand at this and moving on. We're just saying that Alex made this too simplistic and was very dismissive by just, most New Testament scholars. That term gets said a lot, most. New Testament scholars. Well, yeah, in a certain camp, certain criteria, a certain timeline. That's not always the case. And when they actually start doing these consensus, when they actually start doing voting, you find out that these overwhelming majorities aren't as overwhelming as you thought. Wes and I are going to be doing this, just on the pastoral epistles. He and I were gathering. We thought we had the same poll for people who were talking about the pastorals being Paul. Turns out we have two separate polls that were taken where we can now use them together, not just as one, but two, to show, hey, this overwhelming majority conversation needs to stop. Because until you take real consensus, those kind of, like, I can go to all the seminaries in the US and start going based on my experience. The majority of New Testament scholars are saying it's an early date. Well, yeah, that's what you're going to get from the consensus of the scholarship that I'm spending my time around and reading. Just because your worldview and your class of people and your framework of thinking is all echoing the same wording doesn't mean that's the consensus globally in all PhD programs and scholarship.
Right.
We need to stop
where
that
are
language
these-
on both sides.
Where are these polls until you can like show the polls, And I mean, this goes for Christian apologists too.
All of
be
us.
careful.
All of us.
Yeah, be careful about saying scholarly consensus says this, that, or the other, unless you can demonstrate. And I think this has kind of come out more recently with some certain Christian scholars. I'm not going to get into that. Unless you can demonstrate where you're getting your numbers from and you're not cherry picking what people are saying and all this other stuff, you don't really know what the consensus is. You could think most people think this from the people that I'm reading, but like, unless you can actually like provide people actual data with the actual quotes of what people are saying, like just appealing to my consensus and just the majority, like, okay, like whatever.
And consensus is always changing. It's always changing. It's updating itself because it needs to be revised. I'll give a quick example before we jump back in. The Q hypothesis. That was everybody's wish and dream and discussion and books and arguments and articles and blogs. Now all of a sudden there's a tip away from the consensus saying that there is a Q hypothesis. Again, the consensus is always changing. We don't need to always follow the consensus. Now I want to skip ahead for the sake of time.
Yeah.
Let's go to Paul and he puts in quote 400 witnesses.
Yeah.
Oh, good times.
Testament. Okay, moving on. After mentioning the Gospels, Wes goes on to talk about Paul. Whenever the Gospels were written, and by whomever, we know that Paul is the earliest source of the New Testament, dating squarely from the middle of the 1st century. And we think that he actually did write at least 7 of the letters attributed to him. And so it's to him that we now turn.
How do
So,
you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
well,
How many people saw his body, right?
Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion.
No, saw the resurrected
resurrection.
Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all. Paul does write that, quote, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, but that's it. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved. Paul himself wasn't there. Is this just something that he heard about?
That alone is not true because he goes on to say that some of those are still alive. So he obviously knew the existence of some. Like that is, well, that's all he said about it. Well, no, he didn't. He said some of which are still alive to this day.
Yeah.
So let me just say that statement was inaccurate on its own. The second thing, did you catch Joe Rogan's question?
Yeah, it was just a question about who saw him. He wasn't I don't think that Wes was exactly making an apologetic argument. Like 500 people saw him, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. QED atheists, like Joe Rogan, every eye closed, every head bowed, Sorry, showed my
altar call. Bring it
yeah,
down.
yeah. No, he wasn't saying that. He just answered a question. All right. And so that is part of the testimony. That is something that Paul did say. Now, for me, if I'm doing an apologetic about resurrection,
Yep.
I don't use the 500 for a lot of the points that Alex is going to
No.
make. Is
Nor
because
would Wes. Nor would
yeah,
Wes, by the way.
Wes is a maximalist. He's actually very much on the McGroupy kind of side of things. For those of you who are into the whole in-house Christian debates on resurrection, and so no, I'm not going to make an argument because we don't know their names, we don't know who saw them, we don't know what the appearances were like. They're not really described in any kind of detail, and so there are other groups of people who have reported to see things that could be vague, could be not be vague, things that I don't know, that I might not might be like open, like say for example, he brings up Marian apparitions. Okay. And so like there's some stuff that happened in Zaytun, Egypt, that I think even like somebody like Dale Allison, who he quotes in a minute, will say, I don't really know what happened there. I don't know. I can't really explain it away naturalistically, but I don't know. There's just not enough for me to go, yes, I'm a believer. I'm gonna, become Coptic Orthodox now because of these appearances. And so the point that I'm trying to make is there aren't a lot of details. So I'm not going to use that as apologetic either. I want to talk about, and this is something that Alex completely left out in the video, from what I could see, is Wes talks about the details of like the multi-sensory appearances, people touching Jesus, people eating with him, all these other things. And so he just asked a question, who saw him, and reportedly this is part of it. Okay, this is one part of it. I don't think that he's necessarily trying to impress Joe there. It's not an argument that we're trying to use as an apologetic. I don't think people should use it as an apologetic. I think we need the physical details. We need to know any miracle claim at all. We can't just go with kind of like vague, I saw. We need to know like what were the actual details, what were the experiences like. That's what I was complaining about with the whole Book of Mormon stuff and the Angel Moroni. And so he's belaboring this, but he's like belaboring something that like Wes, I don't think is actually saying like, yes, the 500, therefore the resurrection happened. Like that's not what's going on here.
Well, kind of going back to, let's just say the 500 is an argument that's worth narrating. We see that Jesus did appear to some sort of crowd. We don't exactly know the number in the Gospels. And it's just ironic, the whole Mark point that's brought up over and over again. When you're looking at Mark's Gospel, he says, tell my disciples and Peter that I'll meet him in Galilee. I saved it for this point. Now, I know I'm with you. I think you, Wes, myself, we're in similar vein of how to approach the resurrection, the maximal, minimal, etc. I think we're all in the same boat here. But I do want to entertain this just for a second. The benefit of the doubt here, for two reasons. One, Joe Rogan asked the question about how many people, let's just say that all we have is Paul. Wes explicitly said, Paul tells us that there were 500. Well, he said 400 and he meant 500, and it was a mistake. And for people to spend 30 minutes in videos beating that dead horse. In fact, he undersold Christianity by saying 400. There was an extra 100. But let's just say that's the point. Okay. In this statement, we do see that Jesus appeared to crowds. We see it in Acts. We see it in Luke. It's not unusual in 1 Corinthians for Paul to link himself to some of what's in Luke's account. I know that our friends on the other side of the table would say, no, Luke came after 1 Corinthians, blah, 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 blah. But he does use a lot of Luke kind of stuff, especially when dealing with the betrayal, the distribution of the Eucharist. There are audiences. There are people. Now, in Mark's gospel, he says, tell my disciples and Peter, I will meet them in Galilee. Why Galilee? I asked that question earlier. Why Galilee? Well, Galilee was where Jesus had his biggest following. Galilee is where Jesus started most of this. Is where Peter and James and John and Andrew and some of his earliest disciples were seen with him. This is where Jesus had his base. This is where his main essential, his essential followers started following after him, leaving their businesses, coming behind him. Why did Jesus say, meet me back in Galilee, unless he planned on meeting them at the home base where his main, whether it's all the women that you look in his ministry, whether you look at his disciples in his ministry, those that came alongside of him in his ministry, the people he healed, the people he spoke to, the people he did miracles in front of. It's interesting that Jesus wants to go back to Galilee to meet him where his strongest base is. And that is the main point. The main point is his strong base goes back to Galilee. So to say that it's impossible and that Paul just made this up out of thin air, like, oh, well, there's 500. He didn't even know that number. He didn't even know anybody in it. And he had nothing else to say about it. We don't know where he got that number. Well, he didn't just make it up out of thin air. I mean, he had reason to believe and even knew apparently enough of them to know that some were still alive and could be talked to. He wouldn't have said that at the end. So even the Gospels, though they don't give us a number, Eric, do demonstrate at least this. Jesus appeared to more than just 11 people. He appeared to more than 11. Yeah. And he wanted to go back to Galilee. Why? What was in Galilee that Mark is so obsessed with? And Jesus prophetically said, I'm going to die and then I'm going to meet you in Galilee. Why? Because that was where his base was. That's where his main support was. So yeah, Jesus would have probably appeared to a larger group than 11 by just going back to Galilee and speaking to his disciples there. So again, I don't understand the obsession with this. I do want to take up a super chats because they're going to get behind. One of them was a good point. I think you brought this up earlier about the, I think you said this
we were
on the
talking about it backstage, I think. Yeah.
I think you're right about that. Oliver said that they only saw these with spiritual eyes, talking about the golden plates that we were dealing with earlier, and pretty much that all the witnesses were fooled by the plates years later, etc. And that's a good point that I don't think should be ignored either. They saw plates, but what did they see and who actually saw them? Right. So the limitation of that vision.
Right.
Oops. I meant to do the next one.
And we got this bozo.
Oh, man.
You guys only believe this because you are dishonest apologists. If you weren't so dogmatic, you would know that Jesus is an imitation of Dionysius. Stop lying so much. That's right. Yeah. I mean, like the gods trying to chop them up into little pieces, Jesus dying on the cross. It's basically the same thing, it's all just copy and paste. And so I
don't buy these hand-waving arguments that come from what Alex tried to do here. And I think it's actually baiting and switching, because you're taking the contextual conversation between Rogan and between Wes. Rogan asked him an explicit question, and it wasn't a theological, it was just like, where do you get that? Where do you get that from? Well, Paul said that there was. He could have instantly drawn back and said, but I disagree with Paul. And he didn't say that, but like he could have said, that's just what Paul said. But Wes wasn't really getting into it from, like you said, an apologetic viewpoint. And Alex is already coming fists up, like, all right, he brought up the whole 500, know, and it's like, but be fair to the question. Be fair to Joe Rogan's question. Be fair to how.
Well, and even Hedges, he's like, that's what Paul says, and it's like, well, now we got to make it into a big deal. It's like, why are we making this into a big deal? And this is kind of the frustrating thing for me for this whole video is, again, I think Alex has become and evolved from being more of like this kind of cranky, cage stagey kind of atheist to now he has this reputation of being like very fair-minded and charitable. And he invites people like William Lane Craig and other apologists on his channel, and good on Alex for doing that. And I appreciate that. I think that's why he's grown and people like him. But it's frustrating for me to see like this like from what it looks like to me, and he can correct me on this, is just kind of assuming the worst, making uncharitable claims. And I mean, this is kind of like the old cosmic skeptic coming back out of the grave, pun intended. So
I agree, and
it's
that's why I
a
said,
little weird to me.
yeah, you and I were both surprised. That's why I say some of this was petty. Like it was just
Yeah.
really petty.
I expect this from other YouTube atheists, but I didn't expect this from Alex.
no, and that's why we're doing the video that we're doing. And
Yeah.
let's move over to Luke Acts if we can.
Yeah, there we go.
Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of, or the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus's ministry, who were there, say at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said.
Again, Wes appears to be assuming a radically early date for the Gospel of Luke's composition. Most scholars suggest an earlier date of between 80 and 90 AD, in part because of its literary dependence on Mark's Gospel. But even if Luke was earlier than this, any eyewitnesses would have been elderly or dead. And besides, Luke's Gospel only recounts Jesus appearing to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, then the rest of the disciples in Jerusalem before ascending into heaven. The book of Acts implies that he appeared to a few more people, some named, some not. But it's not like we've got a huge list of names that people could find and interrogate, especially since most of them would probably have been dead by then anyway. Also, some scholars are beginning to suggest that Luke Acts might have been written much, with some thinking that it displays a knowledge of the writings of Josephus from the 90s. This is a minority view, but one held by some major players in the field. Whatever the case, the point is, again, that we simply cannot have any certainty on this stuff. Most of it is educated guesswork. For Wes to say with confidence that the Gospels can be dated to within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and especially to say this of all of them, is, I think, again, just too optimistic. We're going to jump forward a bit here now.
Right,
Wes is arguing that
So-
Jesus definitely died on the cross.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, that was a good place to stop.
I mean, there's a lot of different things there. And so one, like it was weird that he's like, well, they would have been elderly. As if elderly like disqualifies somebody's testimony, right? Like
Is that
okay,
a
I
knock
guess
on older people?
yeah, come on, that's ageist of you there, Alex. No, I'm just messing around. But seriously though, like there are elderly people who give their testimonies of being in like surviving the Holocaust. Like we don't just throw out their testimonies because they're elderly. So that's kind of ageist and a little bit strange. But second of all, like he's saying like most scholars, like the earliest that Luke could be is 80. And there are a number of scholars who aren't even necessarily like mega Christian evangelicals or anything else like that, who would date Luke Acts into like the early 60s. And we can get into some of those reasons. But if he's going to say, well, Luke was dependent on Mark, which is fine. I think that he was. That would just push Mark into the even earlier. Our buddy who just popped up and called us dishonest apologists, not so inspiring philosophy. Oh, slam. Just kidding. That was terrible. But he did a video on early dating of the Gospels where he's quoting people like James Crossley and Maurice Casey, who have argued extensively against the resurrection. And Crossley certainly has debated Craig, who dates Mark until like, I want to say like early 40s or 50s. And so like, yeah, I understand what he's saying. Like we're hypothesizing here, but we just have to like, okay, well, let's look at the hypotheses and compare like which one is the best one. Just because there's scholarly disagreement doesn't mean that all the disagreement is based on valid reasons. Some of the reasons why people think that it can't be earlier than 70 with Mark is because, oh no, he predicts that the temple will be destroyed. And it's just like, okay, so we're just saying that supernatural stuff can't happen. People can't predict that the temple was going to be destroyed. Therefore, it must be later. It must be people putting words in Jesus' mouth to make him look like a cool prophet. But I'll bring up one thing real quick with the dating of Luke. Okay. Scholars agree that he uses Mark as a source. I got no problem with that. Luke also wrote Acts, which ends when Paul is alive, under house arrest, waiting for trial in Rome. Now, Paul likely died in the mid to maybe late 60s. Okay. If Acts was written after Paul's death, why would he leave out such a huge event?
Yep.
Okay. Think about this. How many court scenes does Luke have featuring Paul, right? He's got a bunch.
Yeah.
A bunch of court scenes. He's before Felix. He's before Agrippa. He's before a crowd of Jews in chapter 22. There's all these different court scenes. And then to get to Rome, the big one, where he appeals to go before Caesar. And then that's not going to be in there. Adolf von Harnack, who was extremely liberal, didn't believe in the deity of Christ or the physical resurrection. Was one reason. This is one reason why it changed his mind. Now, somebody might fire back and go, well, this is just like a kind of an argument from the silence. No, this is an argument from the purpose of the book. Acts is about, a lot of it is about Paul's court scenes and even some of the apostles' court scenes, because we see that in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 8 was Stephen, 7 and 8 was Stephen. It's kind of like a court scene. And so the whole purpose of the book is weird. So yeah, the silence here is more on the deafening side of things.
Yeah, and let's say, and I think you, it was you, me, maybe Michael Jones, and we did a whole discussion on Luke Acts once. It's been a couple of years, maybe. I don't know. We've done a lot of collaborating together over the years. I can't keep up with it anymore, Eric. We're getting old. But we've done a lot of videos, and I think we did one just specifically on Acts and all the wrong claims in it. It was either on your channel, it was on Michael's channel.
Yeah,
it was on somebody's.
Yeah.
Please go back and find these. Just type in our names, Luke Acts. We've probably talked about this on 50 platforms and then our own platforms. So just if you're listening through Facts, you're listening through Testify, just go through any of them, okay? Here's another thing. Let's just say Alex is right. Let's say that Acts is dated around 80 AD. We have from documentation like the Anti-Marcionite Prologue and then the Muratorian Fragment that both talk about Luke. The Anti-Marcionite Prologue actually goes into the age that Luke was when he died. It says that he was 84 years old. Okay. He was 84 when he died in central Greece. I think it mentions Boeotia somewhere in there near central Greece. And he never married. He never fathered children, and that he lived a long age. So even if, let's say it wasn't before Paul's death, which I think all the evidence shows that it does, and you touched on some of that just a second ago. Let's just say it doesn't. If Luke waited to 70 to 80 AD or 80 AD to actually write the Gospel of Luke, what's wrong with that?
Right.
What's wrong with
he
that?
has all his notes. Right. Yeah, exactly.
If he lived to be 84, and we're assuming the Anti-Marcionite Prologue is correct here, which is an odd number. You know, you think if you're making that up, you'd round it up to like 85 or something. And then you wouldn't give it exact location and his marital status and his father's status. You know, like, never owed child support, never married. You know, like that's like, who leaves that kind of statement unless they had some sort of historical information? Here's the point. What if it was written in 80 AD? Are you still? This is the point I keep having with Alex. He's done this with John. Now he's done this with Luke. Even if they are later, what you're saying is old men can't have accounts written on their behalf or with their authority or with their understanding and have documents put together with their collected journals or their collected memories or their collected stories. That's what, because where do we wipe history away if we start on that? How many people wrote these entire treaties as young men in the ancient world? Yeah, there's examples of it, but some of them were very, very old when they wrote their greatest works. They were in the last 4 to 5 years of their life. What if Luke lived to be 84 And he had the Gospel of Luke compiled in his 70s. He was a 75-year-old man when it was distributed. So even if Luke is dated to 80 AD, what difference does it make to the reality that he is reporting things and in Acts, things he was clearly at, especially when the we, us, and our passages, all of a sudden details go up. He's on ships. He's talking about the different goddesses and the designs, and he's talking about the number of people that were in the logs, and all this.
Right.
I mean, we've done multiple stories in this. This is nonsense. It's nonsense, and it's
and I think to push back on this whole Luke borrowed Josephus garbage and this like late dating stuff, which is pretty silly. Carrier does talk about it. I'm trying to remember who is it. It's Mason. Mason is the one who really floats that theory. And so to me, there's no way, because Luke is obviously a traveling companion of Paul. And we know that because we can look at Paul's letters. And most people would agree that Luke's not borrowing from Paul's letters, because they like to point out, well, what about this contradiction between Acts and Paul's letters, and that contradiction about Acts and Paul's letters? And I think that those can be reasonably and plausibly harmonized or whatever in a way that isn't forced, but it's pretty clear that he's not copying. So, I mean, just to give like a couple of examples that kind of demonstrate this. And so Acts 14:37 through 41, there's a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas about bringing Mark with them on their missionary journey. And you're kind of like, okay, well, what's going on? Why does Barnabas, why is he so like adamant about taking Mark with him? If we're just reading Acts, we don't really know. But if we look at Colossians 4:10, we actually find out, it says, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, right? So it's really doubtful that like whoever is writing Colossians, which I believe is the Apostle Paul, is looking at something in Acts and going, you know what? I'm going to explain in this really weird and subtle kind of way why there was this big fight between Paul and Barnabas to the point where they actually separated. I'm not going to mention that separation at all. I'm just going to kind of throw Mark in there. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it does make a whole lot of sense if like Mark is kin, Barnabas wants to take him with him, and Luke is just actually reporting what happened because he was familiar with Paul's journeys, and at some parts he was actually with him. Or like another example in 1 Thessalonians 2:2, Paul says that he was treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. And if we're just reading 1 Thessalonians 2:2, where it's kind of like weird, it's like, what is this mysterious statement? We don't really know what happened in Philippi. Like, fill us in on the details, Paul. What happened in Philippi? We don't really know. But if we look at Acts 16:22 through 24 describes Paul and Silas being illegally beaten and jailed by the magistrates in Philippi. And so you could imagine Paul having and this was just the place that he left. And then he leaves Philippi, he goes to Thessalonica. You could imagine him, it's still fresh in his mind. He's like, yeah, I had to put my Karen wig on. I asked for the supervisor. He's telling it all about him, right? Telling them all about it. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of these. I have a whole playlist that you guys can take a look at of these little incidental interlockings that are best explained if Paul is an actual traveling companion of Luke. There's also a lot of external confirmation. And so let me just throw one more thing out there. So in Acts 23:1 through 5, Paul appears before a Jewish council, and he's struck on the mouth at the request of Ananias, the high priest. And Paul is like, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. And they're like, hey, are you going to defy the high priest? Are you going to talk bad about the high priest like that? And Paul just kind of not sheepishly, kind of cheekily says, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know that he was the high priest. And so this raises a question of like, how does Paul not recognize Ananias, the high priest? Like, what's the deal? Like, shouldn't he recognize that? It's kind of weird. But if we actually go to Josephus' Antiquities, we find out that Ananias, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, held the office of high priest during Quadratus' presidency. However, Ananias was later sent to Rome by Quadratus to explain his actions. He was basically called on the carpet to Claudius Caesar and wasn't reinstated upon his return. Then Jonathan succeeded him, but was assassinated. And so the high priest position was actually vacant until Ismail, the son of Fabi, was appointed by King Agrippa. The events in Acts 23 occurred exactly during the period of this vacancy, with Ananias assuming the role of the high priest without any, official conferment. He wasn't like officially put in place by Agrippa. He just decided, hey, there's an opening here and I'm going to slide right back in. And so Luke doesn't explicitly provide the historical context, but he does, through this conversation, support the accuracy of Acts. And some suggest that Paul was actually being kind of cheeky and sarcastic, saying, oh, I didn't know he was the high priest, as if like, you're not, you're a usurper. And so it's really unlikely that somebody is combing through Josephus and going, wow, what a really neat detail. I'm going to put that in there, but I'm not going to give any historical context. And people are going to just be in awe of what an amazing historian I am, even though like they might not ever even, Theophilus or whoever might not even have read Josephus, or like the people who are reading this aren't going to read Josephus. And so, and there's just example after example of all this like historical corroboration from Paul's letters, from history that we actually know, that this is just way better explained as a first century document by somebody who's actually traveling with Paul. And so that's why I don't think we can just like slough off Luke and go, oh, this testimony doesn't count. And one final thing, if he was a traveling companion with Paul, then he was with Paul in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 21, where it says that James and all the elders were present. So if James and all the elders were present, and then Paul is also in prison in Caesarea Maritima, which is only 75 miles away from Jerusalem, don't you think he would have had opportunity to interview eyewitnesses, which is exactly what he tells us in his prologue that he did?
And it's interesting that there's a quiet period in Acts with a gap between our chapters where almost a year goes by. And it seems like, when you're reading Acts, it's like, and then this happened, and then it's like this is a big event. There's actually major gaps where the author goes very quiet, and then he takes us and fast forwards. And if we actually, and I demonstrated this, and those that are listening to the podcast on this side of it, facts, if you go to the archives, it might be on the podcast. Actually, I'm not even sure because we have only been on YouTube for less than a year. I'm trying to think. It actually might be on another channel, if not this one. I demonstrated that we can actually date the book of Acts just with the Muratorian fragment, or Luke and Acts with the Muratorian fragment, Anti-Marcionite prologue, and Acts together. We can come up within 3 years based on the dates and the ages and all those things where Luke and Acts would be based, and when the Gospel of Luke was written and how long it took. And my estimation from that and my scholarly consensus, if you would, within my own brain, landed with it took 2 to possibly 3 years for Luke to collect all the data, and that he made 2 major trips that involved meeting eyewitnesses, including the one you just mentioned, which is the biggest one, where he would have met eyewitnesses with Paul and had collected them there. He would also run into other witnesses who had already dispersed in another place. It would have taken 2 to 3 years to collect and possibly even write. And then you got the publication of that. Again, there is reasonable cause within the traditions and the texts that we do have, like these other non-biblical texts, to look at them, to put them together like a puzzle piece, and it actually creates a clear picture. We can't say definitively 100%, but it does create a clear picture that there would be a timeline that's reasonable with the epistles of Paul, the connective activity that he mentions in them, with what Luke's reporting on the other hand. Paul is now also giving shout outs to Luke's gospel in the books that we talked about, like 1 Corinthians, like he does in 2 Timothy or 1 Timothy. Now you start seeing these back and forth using each other. Now all of a sudden Paul's talking about my gospel. He's making these claims like in Romans. Even if you don't accept the Pauline, he does say it in Romans. That one's not disputed. What gospel is he talking about? Well, it wasn't just simply a message. And how did the early church understand Paul to say that? What was he referring to when he said my gospel? Eusebius talks about it. There's a lot here that needs to be considered, and I agree the waving the hand is not the way to handle these matters. All right, let's get a couple more clips here.
Yep.
We'll try to wrap this up.
And 400 people saw him afterwards.
That's the claim that Paul makes.
Paul makes this.
Yeah.
Did you catch that? And it's
Yeah.
interesting that Alex plays this section, but again, I digress.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay, let's break this down. Wes just mentioned 7 names, including some gospel authors. We'll start with the non-gospel sources.
Peter, Paul, Jude, James.
Peter, Paul, Jude, and James. Remember, we're looking for people who wrote about witnessing the resurrection. Although interestingly, Rogan actually only asked about who has been attributed as writing about witnessing the resurrection, not necessarily who actually did write about it.
Or something that's attributed to them.
But even then, there are problems. So first is Peter. There are 2 epistles in the New Testament attributed to this apostle. 1st and 2nd Peter. Importantly, most scholars do not think that Peter actually wrote both of these texts, especially 2nd Peter, which is one of the most disputed texts in the New Testament. They're still early texts, but probably not both written by Peter. At least one of them is likely a forgery. There are scholars who defend the Petrine authorship of both epistles, of course, but the consensus is against them. Second is Paul. There are 13 epistles in the New Testament attributed to Paul, but many of these are also believed not to have actually been written by him. The consensus is that 7 of them are undisputedly his, whereas the rest are contested. Some, like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are firmly believed to be pseudonymous, written by somebody else. But even if Paul wrote all of these letters, remember what we're looking for here. Remember what Rogan asked.
Some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection.
Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Even his conversion story in Acts just describes him seeing a flash of light and hearing the voice of Christ while on the road to Damascus.
All right.
He never even
hold on,
claimed
hold
to
on.
meet the risen Jesus in the flesh.
Oh my.
Yeah. Whoa. Okay. What happened? If you're going to grant us Acts, thank you. But what about the blindness? What about the people that heard the voice? What about him going to Ananias and being healed of his blindness? What about Paul later, after encountering the resurrected Jesus, is commissioned by the Holy Spirit and is able to have work miracles? Did my camera just go off?
Briefly.
Anyways. Yeah, okay.
We can hear you. I can hear you though.
The light's not on. I don't know what's going on. But the light's not on, but nobody's home. But anyway, so yeah, it's a weird claim. Because it's not just a light. Like he cherry picked one detail there and ignored the rest of it. It's odd.
Well, again, while you're doing that, like again, here's the point. Oh my goodness, how much do we need to actually get into Galatians and the resurrection? I mean, I debated Richard Carrier on this matter on historicity of Jesus and so forth. There are multiple claims. You cannot get out of 1 Corinthians 15. You cannot get out of 1 Corinthians 15 and say that Paul did not teach some sort of resurrection of Jesus or that he had any experience with him. That is part of the early creed that we see in the first few verses of chapter 15. He most certainly did. Even if you don't have Acts, he most certainly did in his epistles. Right. There's so much wrong in what was just said there, and from Acts, from the epistles and onward, it's not true. And yes, Rogan asked for a specific thing, and I'll say this for Wes. I don't think that Wes necessarily had 1 Peter in mind necessarily in 2 Peter, although I would agree. I would think that he's on the same boat with us, where we believe that they are, and there's explanations 2 Peter. But I think that what Wes was probably speaking of was Peter's eyewitness testimony within the Gospel of Mark. If I was a betting person,
right?
Because we all believe Mark's writing the sermons of Peter. So having known Wes in that position, but again, then I thought he would take more issue with Jude, which again, he covers these names, but like I would have spent more time there than to go into this. Well, nowhere does Paul ever claim to have seen or it's like, what?
Yeah, that is kind of
Galatians.
like I think Apologia did a response, and I think he actually did a better job here.
Yep.
And so, because he's like, okay, there's no resurrection in Jude. Like, what are we talking about here? And so, um, so yeah, there is. I mean, I guess you could say, well, there's deity of Christ in First Peter, and there's deity of Christ in Jude and Second Peter. And so like it's not like hard to imagine resurrection because like what would force you to that particular belief. But that's not an argument I would necessarily make. And so, but yeah, to focus on all we have from Acts is Paul saw a light is like that's not all we have from Acts. Like that's not all that we have from Acts at all. That's like a terrible reading of Acts. That's like really kind of like that's more inexcusable than saying it was 400, by a lot. And it's kind of up there with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, no, Paul had this other experience and these other reasons to believe that he saw the risen Jesus, and that the disciples accepted his testimony and put him in charge over taking up an offering for Jerusalem and sent him out to the Gentiles. And so it's kind of like, what are we doing here?
I don't know the Jude part either. Maybe he was thinking Jude 1:14 with the prophecy of the Lord coming back with 10,000s of his saints, which would imply resurrection, perhaps.
Yeah.
But again, I'm with you. To me, to pick Paul here and say, well, Paul never, and say, wait, what? Like 1 Corinthians, Galatians. I mean, even if you only accept 7, which he was granting us all Pauline epistles, but even if you just go with the 7, there's plenty there just in those sections alone that actually debunk what he just said. So that was kind of surprising.
Which I think
Yeah.
is what Rogan is looking for here. Our third name is Jude. There's one short epistle in the New Testament which claims to be written by Jude, the brother of James. James being James, the brother of Jesus. Surprise, surprise, this is highly disputed. But whatever the case, it doesn't actually matter because the real problem is this. Jude's epistle doesn't even mention the resurrection. It's not in there. So Wes is wrong even just to say that a written witness to the resurrection has been attributed to Jude, let alone actually written by him. Rogan is looking here for accounts of the resurrection written by those who witnessed it.
Well, you can't come back if you're not already back from the dead. Like a living Jesus can't come back with 10,000 of his saints in a second coming if he's still dead on earth. He can't come from heaven unless he was taken there. So, I mean, I get what he's saying here, and I don't necessarily disagree with him here, but take it from Wes's viewpoint too, that we believe the fullness of the New Testament is already assumed that Jesus is bodily resurrected and that he's going to return. And I would imagine that's what Wes had in mind, but I don't want to speak for him. He didn't explicitly give me a statement to share from that one.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, if I were on the spot, I probably wouldn't use Jude as a witness. And so it's like he has some fair points. On the other hand, like if we're trying to be charitable to Wes, I mean, first of all, like Jude Jude verse 5. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. It's like, okay, well, he's basically calling him Yahweh from the Old Testament. I know there's kind of some dispute with the manuscripts on this particular one, but I want to say that most people do translate it. In most translations, it's translated as Jesus. And then there's what you said, he can't come back unless he's already been resurrected and different things like that. And so that might be a charitable way of looking at it. Again, I don't have as much problem with what Alex is saying here. Just the Paul one, that's weird.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to. I think it's nitpicking again because you're dealing with a Christian scholar who's looking at all the New Testament as a harmonized front to advance the gospel message that's assumed through its pages, and that these kind of epitones in them are actually being revisited and explained from different angles. But again, this is what it looks like to look at the world from two different worldviews, because Alex is looking at it one way. Wes is looking another way. Alex is saying, well, and this is what bothered me about Alex too. It's like, well, I don't think that's what Joe was asking. Well, why didn't you do that to yourself a few minutes ago? Like, you didn't grant that earlier when you were talking about the eyewitnesses. You weren't granting that earlier when Wes talked about the 500. Now all of a sudden you care about how and what Joe asked. Like, that part's what surprised me here about Alex, because again, I have a level of respect for Alex as opposed to many of the others in that crowd. And he's being fair to Joe here, but he wasn't being fair to Joe's question earlier. And to me, there was an inconsistent grudge, and I didn't like that, and it's unusual for him.
Yeah,
Jude
it's just a
simply
little
doesn't
unusual.
count, even if he did write that epistle, because he simply doesn't write about the resurrection in it. And there's a similar problem with the fourth name that Wes mentions, James, whose epistle in the New Testament, again with some dispute over the authorship, also simply does not recount his witness to the resurrection. Wes is wrong to bring him up as well. So, asked by Joe Rogan for people who wrote about the resurrection, Wes Huff is choosing people who have letters attributed to them, but either didn't actually write them or didn't even claim in those letters to have seen the resurrected Jesus. Wes then talks about the gospel authors.
We have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus. Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact, Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that.
Just a point of clarification here. Where Wes says that the gospels of Matthew and John are attributed to the apostles, Matthew and John, they're not attributed by the texts themselves.
Yes.
The gospels do not anywhere identify their own authors. They don't even claim to be written by anyone in particular.
And again, we don't want to spend a lot of time here. We've covered this extensively on both our channels on Inspiring Philosophy. Go back to the series. In fact, I'll probably just put the series in the link when this is done to Inspiring Philosophy that goes into the, there's no inscription within the text itself argument. So we won't even spend time on that. We've answered it extensively. I'll put a link so you can find it.
It's later Christian tradition which associates those names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with the Gospels. I'm not saying that Wes claimed that the Gospels do identify their own authors, by the way. I just think it might have been unclear for somebody listening, so just pointing it out. But some people, and I don't know if Wes is one of them, do think that John's Gospel does identify its author, does tell us who wrote it. But he doesn't do this by saying, my name's John and I wrote this Gospel. Instead, throughout the Gospel, a disciple is mentioned, who's only ever identified as the one whom Jesus loved. Here's an example from John chapter 19, the crucifixion of Jesus. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, the disciple took her into his home. So the beloved disciple is quite an important figure, seemingly the person who looks after Mary, the mother of God, after Jesus dies. Later in that same chapter, the text says, the man...
Did you hear that? Mary, the mother of God. I thought the New Testament didn't claim that. Interesting. I don't know if you picked up on that, Erik.
No,
I
didn't.
He just gave credibility to Mary, the mother of God. So do you believe he's God? Claim to be God? John's claiming he's God? I thought you were doing a video debunking that. But now he's saying that she's the mother of God. Interesting. Also, at this point, even if it's, and by the way, Dr. Richard Bauckham, who wrote Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, one of the best works you can find out there, he actually goes into this because he actually doesn't believe that John, the son of Zebedee, is the author. I actually differ respectfully with my Anglican cohort. I respectfully disagree with him on this point because he thinks that it is actually a different John or a different person in the accounts, like right here, that is separate from John, son of Zebedee. And our friend, I believe, Inspiring Philosophy is also that persuasion. So that's not the point. The point is that these are eyewitness accounts. These are eyewitness accounts. Going back to his point, Rogan wants eyewitness accounts. Well, even if it's not John the Apostle and it's John the Elder, the other John that's mentioned by Papias of Hierapolis, even if it's him, it's still an eyewitness account. The passage he's on tells us that he was at the foot of the cross. So he was definitely giving an insider's view, even if his name was Jeff. I mean, like, he's still giving an insider's view.
Right.
I don't like this argument at all. So he goes on, and then, he finishes it by going to the end of John.
Who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. And it looks implied here that the man being spoken about is the beloved disciple, who's mentioned just a moment earlier. In John chapter 21, Jesus is talking about the beloved disciple, and then the text says, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." He's the one that wrote them down. Now, the beloved disciple is often identified with John, the son of Zebedee, that is, the apostle John. And since we're told here that it's him who wrote it all down, John is the author of this gospel. That is why some people claim that John's gospel identifies its author. But there are a few problems with this. First, the beloved disciple is never explicitly named as John. Nobody knows who it is. He's mentioned 6 times in total, only in the Gospel of John, but is never named. Some people think that it might be Lazarus, for example. Some people even think that it might be Mary Magdalene, but I think that's a bit tenuous. But suppose we just knew that the beloved disciple is John. Fine. Still, notice that the 4th Gospel only ever speaks about the beloved disciple in the 3rd person. In John 19, the man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. It's not clear that this man is the same man writing down the words that we're reading right now. It's not even clear that this man is the beloved disciple, who's mentioned some 9 verses earlier as standing nearby the cross with the 3 Marys. He's the only man that's mentioned stood nearby, so it might have been him, but we don't know. We're never explicitly told. Okay, but in John 21, we're told that the beloved disciple wrote his testimony down. Fine, but again, it's in the 3rd person. It doesn't say, I, the beloved disciple, wrote these things down. It says, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true.
Now, I've done extensive work on this. I believe that John's gospel is a group gospel. I've said it for years. I believe that John's gospel is a group gospel. And what you see at the very end there is the author and the scribes separated for a minute to distinguish. The scribes turning and affirming the testimony of the author and writing that testimony. We see it's a group gospel in early Christian literature. Let's go back to the Muratorian fragment in the Anti-Marcionite prologue. Again, what we find in these documents is that John did not actually show interest in producing a gospel. It was actually the elders and other eyewitnesses that were still alive that pushed him to do so. Clement of Alexandria actually recounts the same thing, that there were people in the Johannine community who wanted to make an account with John's testimony, but that it would be a group account. We have so much information that it goes on to say that John told those that were with him, and it explicitly mentions Andrew, the apostle, which makes sense. He's one of the first disciples on the scene in the Gospel of John, and we don't see him show up that early as we do in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so in the very beginning here, they come back, praying, fasting 3 days. Andrew comes back and says, I think you should do this. I think you should narrate a gospel in your name as we call these things to memory. And so it was instantly a group gospel. In fact, Papias has been identified as one of the potential scribes who was doing the writing. It's not that John himself was the writer as much as he is the author, and that he is actually telling a broader view of time and instance between the synoptics and is demonstrating a full-blown understanding of what happened there. And so I have made an argument. Again, go back and find all these, like we've done multiple episodes on this. I believe John's gospel is a group gospel done by the Johannine community. John is the author and the narrator. his scribes are helping him while also contributing to the narratives themselves. And so in the instance that he brought up, specifically there, where in the end of the gospel you find we know his kind of terminology, is because now you see the scribe or scribes, excuse me, and the author both now showing themselves in the text and then pulling themselves back out. Now, whether or not it's John the Apostle or not doesn't necessarily matter to his criticism, because it is an eyewitness who's telling an insider's view. And it's apparent that even if he's there, somebody else is writing it down for him.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, we read throughout the whole gospel that there's a disciple who goes unnamed, like right at the beginning, who's described as the beloved disciple. And at the end, like Alex points out, we're told outright that he was the author. And it seems to me like this isn't any weirder than Tertius, jumping into Romans and being like, hey, Tertius wrote this letter.
I wrote it.
Yeah. And so, but if we look at all the different list of those present in the scenes, like at the beginning, like at 135 where he's called, and then 21:2, including cross references from the Synoptic Gospels, this person was in their inner circle of Jesus, right? And so who do you have in the inner circle of Jesus? You got there's Andrew, Peter, James, and John. But Andrew appears with him in the opening chapter, so it's not him. And it can't be Peter because Peter's in the closing chapter and James was martyred. And so just through a process of elimination, it seems like the best explanation is that it is this particular person. Yep. And so there's also the fact that he never disambiguates John the Baptist, unlike some of the other gospel writers. He just says there was a man sent from God whose name was John, and he doesn't include the phrase the Baptist like we find in those other gospels. So why doesn't he distinguish him from John the son of Zebedee? Because John the son of John was the author, right? And he doesn't have to distinguish himself from various Johns in the use of his names. When he said John, everybody knew what he meant. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that's like a slam dunk argument for the authorship, but it is a evidential chip, in favor. So, and there's a lot of other things that we could go into. We've gone into so much of this stuff in detail in so many of our other videos, and that's why we were able to just kind of jump on here quickly after the video was released and just kind of talk about it a little bit, because these are things that we've talked about, you and I, for a really long time. And I would just definitely recommend people to not take this one-sided approach with scholarship, and look at the other side of things, so.
Yeah. And I'd love at some point in history to just talk about John's gospel with Alex, even if it was a private conversation on the side, and just say, hey, let's actually talk through this, because I think you bring up good points. I think you bring up good ideas, and you are recognizing a mechanism within the text that's unusual, but it actually can be explained if you guys would stop throwing the church fathers out and saying that they're just prejudice. You can actually solve the problem. And so I would love the opportunity to do that. We do have one super chat before closing out here that also came in. I asked Bart if he said, nowhere in the Bible does Jesus himself say, I am Yahweh or I'm God. When he asked, he knows all the points you've pointed. He does. And actually, Bart Ehrman doesn't deny that Jesus claims to be God in John. I'm assuming he's talking about Bart Ehrman. So if I'm,
it's probably not Bart Simpson.
No, not Bart Simpson, just the Bart Ehrman. But no. Thanks for your super chats there. And those that are listening, thanks for joining the joint episode. If you're listening from Testify, or if you're listening from Facts, those that are listening from Facts, if you don't know Erik, you don't know his channel, please go over to his channel on Testify. Make sure you hit that like, subscribe button. He and I are friends. We talk probably every week in a group chat with a group of us. And we're constantly collaborating work and ideas and criticizing each other and also encouraging one another. So make sure you follow Erik on his channel. If you're listening on Testify, you can switch over, click my channel, Facts, which is an acronym, Fathers, Apocryphal, Canon, Text, Scripture. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe button there as we continue to collaborate together and put out material. And in these channels, you'll find a lot of the references that we made throughout, saying go back and listen to more extensive stuff. But we do appreciate you. We appreciate your time, your energy to take on a Saturday afternoon to listen to two guys who are a little bit thrown off and disturbed by a video released this morning. But at the same time, we also know Wes. Wes is our friend, and there's an angle on this that I think was unfair. And I think there's a lot of that going on around. And we wanted to make sure that you knew that even though there were some mistakes made that Wes admitted, and Wes wanted me to share this. I'm going to read this on our exit. See if I make sure I've got it. Yep. He said, "You are more than welcome to mention that I do think the Isaiah scroll has variants, and I'm in the process of making a video outlining what I meant and where I could have been better." And I read that earlier, but maybe you missed it. He's going to be putting out his own video soon, so keep your eyes and ears open for that. Criticizing himself where he did misspeak, and also clarifying where he's been misrepresented on the side as well. All right, Erik, any other last words before we close it out?
No, I think that's it. Definitely subscribe to my guy Steven here. He's got a lot of really good stuff on canon, authorship, traditional authorship of lots of stuff or in the New Testament. And so, and a lot of people don't know this, but you actually help inspiring philosophy with a lot of what he's done on defending the reliability of the New Testament. And so yeah, you're flying under the radar. So I hope more people find you, because I've been helped by a lot of it. And once I found like your initial playlist, I just binged them. So definitely help yourselves out.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, sometimes being under the radar is better. Wes is learning that the hard way.
Wes is learning that right now. You got all the crab bucket people coming out and being like, well, actually.
Sometimes it's a quieter life that way. But no, I appreciate your shout out. All right, folks, that's all we've got time for today. As always, if you have any questions, you can go in and leave comments. I'll probably go back later and check those. Thanks again for tuning into this episode. Grace and peace to you. God bless.